Thanks for coming. So I want to start by making reference to a series of talks I started giving back in 2008. I was sort of disgusted by some of what seemed like the silliness of what a lot of developers were doing with social media, the startup frenzy and the bubble mania. And I gave a talk called Work on Stuff That Matters and wrote a blog post about it in January of 2009. I was thinking it was a wasted opportunity that developers weren't working on the world's great problems. But then, when we had the financial crisis, it was clear that it was more than just a wasted opportunity. It was something deeply wrong with our economy. We've had companies that seem to have forgotten a principle that O'Reilly has tried to live by, which is that a business should create more value than it captures. And so we've had this idea, which was originally promulgated, I believe, by Milton Friedman in the 80s, which was that the only responsibility of a company is to make money for its shareholders. In fact, they're legally responsible to do that. And I call it the big lie of modern business. It's very clearly a lie, if only because of the way that company management typically loots the shareholders in the form of excessive executive compensation. But there's so many other ways that this is just wrong. I recommend this book by Lynn Stout about why it's wrong. And there's a wonderful paper that I came across by George Akerlof and Paul Romer called Looting, which really predicted what we saw in the financial crisis. He said the normal economics of maximizing economic value is replaced by the topsy-turvy economics of maximizing current extractable value, which tends to drive the firm's economic net worth deeply negative. And this kind of short-term thinking, people taking out way more than they put in, has been incredibly destructive to our economy. And I contrast this with the vision of business that was put forth in Les Miserables, Victor Hugo's wonderful, humane novel about, so many things. So what can I say? It's just a wonderful book about how to live. And Jean Valjean is a former criminal. He was arrested originally for stealing a loaf of bread, spent time in jail, was eventually released on parole, gets in trouble again, goes under an assumed name and becomes a businessman. And he makes this whole region that he lives in prosperous. The quote was, "There was no pocket so obscure that it had not little money in it, no dwelling so lowly that there was not some little joy within it." But the key point that Victor Hugo makes, he says, Father Madeleine, that was his pseudonym, made his fortune, but a singular thing in a simple man of business. It did not seem as though that were his chief care. He appeared to be thinking much of others and little of himself. So he was working to make everyone prosperous, and he became prosperous through that process. And this is a point that Nick Hanauer made in kind of a wonderful, somewhat controversial TED University talk that I saw earlier this year. It's controversial because TED actually refused to put it up online for a long time. It was kind of a stink about it. Because what Nick said, and I should say who Nick is, Nick was the first non-family investor in Amazon.com. He was the founder of Aquantive, which was acquired by Microsoft for $6 billion. He's a very, very, very successful capitalist. And he gave this wonderful talk in which he said, he addressed this big lie, and he said, I want to tell you that capital does not create jobs. He said customers create jobs. And that if we don't have a vibrant cycle in which there are people who can afford to buy our products, the whole system falls down. Now, that seems like common sense to me, that it's a system, an economy in which everyone does well. And Nick talks about that in his book, which he wrote with Eric Liu, called Gardens of Democracy. And this is sort of wonderful, seemingly tautological line. We all do better when we all do better. And that's how I think about business. And, so I've been really thinking a lot about this. This is some pictures, a picture I took when I went to Occupy Wall Street back in September of last year. And you saw this sense that there's something wrong. with the way our economy is working. We see a focus on income inequality. And so I started asking myself, how do we make the economy better while also creating a richer, fairer world? This is a key question that all of us need to be wrestling with. And I keep coming back to this notion that we articulated at O'Reilly a dozen years ago, that it's essential for companies to create more value than they capture. And an economy really is an ecosystem. It's not just like an ecosystem, it is an ecosystem. And what we know about ecosystems is that if you take more out than you put in, the ecosystem eventually fails. And this is something that some of these guys, up there have pictures of Bernie Madoff and Alan Stanford and Charles Ponzi, the eponymous source of the famous Ponzi scheme, didn't care about. These guys, Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, Vikram Pant of Citigroup, they seem to have forgotten it too. That their job is to create value, not to extract it. But here's a set of people who didn't forget that. Now you guys, I'm sure, recognize those faces. They have all created enormous value. The open source communities, the internet, are a gift by people who didn't actually make great fortunes. Some of those people have done okay. I'm looking at you, Monty. But most of those creators up there gave something away, and it became uniquely valuable to a lot of other people. Some of these guys have made huge fortunes, at least in part making use of the software that was created by those people who created more value than they captured, the ones on the last slide. And you might be surprised to see Bill Gates up there along with the rest. You go, well, gosh, everybody else you can say, yeah, they built on open source software in some way. But even Microsoft has used a lot of open source, has come to actually embrace it, as we predicted many years ago they would. But for those of you who are around the industry back in the early 90s, when Microsoft was really running out of gas. I made this joke before, and some of you may be too young to remember this, but their idea of the future was this product called Microsoft Bob. And it was just a total disaster. And then along came the internet, and they had a renaissance with Windows 95, which was their product that really tried to embrace the internet. And so they got another 10-year run on the back of open source and the internet. But there are companies even beyond these obvious usual suspects. And this really became clear to me recently when I had a conversation with Hari Srinivasan, who is the CEO of something called Endurance International Group, a company I hadn't ever heard of. They're actually the parent of Bluehost, which is one of our sponsors here, actually as a result of this conversation I had with Hari. Hari came to me and he said, I built my business on open source software, and I want to give something back. And I said, tell me more. And he started talking about how the web hosting business is really an open source subscription business. What do you get when you do web hosting? You get subscription access to a bunch of open source software. It's a business model, not one of the obvious ones, but it's a business model for the software that you guys build. So I started talking with Hari more and more about this, and in the course of our conversation, I remembered this wonderful paper by a guy named Steve Baer that I read in this magazine, Coevolution Quarterly, which was Stuart Brand's successor to the Whole Earth Catalog. And I'm giving away my age when I say that this was published in 1975. But it stuck in my mind all this time. And the essence of the argument in the Clothesline Paradox is that if you put your clothes in the dryer, the energy you use is measured and counted. But if you hang them on the clothesline, it just disappears from our economic accounting. And it struck me how much that's also true of open source. We may know in some visceral sense that we've created all this value and that other people have built on it. But we haven't told that story. And so I started brainstorming with Hari about whether we could work together to tell that story. And we start with this notion that the companies that explicitly have monetized open source, like Red Hat or Acquia or MySQL or Cloudera or WordPress, are a little bit like the way that solar is represented in these energy charts. You know, this is what Steve Baer talked about in the Clothesline Paradox. He's like, come on, it grows our food, it does all these ecosystem services we get from the sun. Even our fossil fuels are basically sun from a long time ago. And yet you look at the charts and there's this little slice on renewables, and then solar's this little tiny slice at the top. You know, what are we missing? You know, that's the Clothesline Paradox. So, you know, as I mentioned, these companies have all built and created enormous value using open source. But I thought not just Bluehost, because Bluehost made this, you know, Hari made this great point that web hosting and domain name registration is effectively, you know, this open source subscription business. But I also realized that ISPs like Comcast are selling access to open source software. And that's a $79 billion market, very profitable in the US alone, right? So when people go and they pay an ISP for access to the internet, yeah, sure, you know, the carrier would have you think, oh, well, you're paying access to our pipes. But why do you want those pipes? You know, it's a little bit like the water company saying, you know, you're paying us for access to our pipes. Or the electric company saying, you're paying us for access to our wires. No, you're paying for access to what goes through those pipes and over those wires. And in the case of your subscription to your ISP, you are, in fact, paying for access to the free software that you and people like you have created, and the content, the free content that people like you have created and shared on the net. So, but there's a further point that Hari made that really struck me. And that was, he pointed to a McKinsey report called Internet Matters, the net sweeping impact on growth, jobs, and prosperity. McKinsey made the point that having a website increases the productivity of small businesses by 10%. And I was really struck by this because that really shows how there's this huge downstream effect. You know, Hari's saying to me, hey, you know, we're able to offer these web hosting services to SMBs. And actually, I should say that the hosting companies, according to a survey done by Bluehost, approximately 70% of their hosting customers are small businesses, not individuals. So if having a website increases the success of these small businesses, really, that's where the value of open source is ultimately getting captured in the economy by, you know, millions and millions of people, many of whom may not actually even know that they're using open source. Although actually, based on the survey, we found that many of them had more awareness than we would have thought. So we wrote this report with Bluehost. It's available down in the O'Reilly booth. It's also available for download. It's got some interesting stats about the kind of software that is in use, at least among Bluehost customers, and its relative importance. Some survey of about 4,000 Bluehost customers, and then data from about 1 million customers that we analyzed. But here's the thing. This is a pretty wonky model, because what we did was we took the survey data in which people reported their size of their business, and then applied it across the million customers. We said, okay, so about 70% are businesses. Well, how big are they? And then we did the math, you know, and we said, well, how many companies is it, and how much revenue is that? And we came up with $124 billion worth of revenue in the small businesses that are using, you know, free software via Bluehost services. And, you know, we figure, you know, they don't disclose their market share, but we figure they're 10, 12% of the overall hosting market based on domain name surveys and stuff like that. So that means we're talking about literally $1.5 trillion of output that's sort of in small businesses that are, you know, getting benefit through web hosting. So it's a pretty big market and a pretty big gift that was made by this community to people who are benefiting downstream. So I started thinking about other Clothesline Paradox economies, this sort of sharing economy that the internet has made possible. And okay, I'm not getting my click. Okay. And I thought a little bit about, back to ISPs. We have this mythology that everybody on the net wants their content for free. And I said, well, wait, what's wrong with this picture? I pay $70 a month to Comcast to watch television, and they think I'm paying for content. I pay $70 a month to Comcast to use the internet, and I'm getting it for free. Somebody is kidding themselves, right? And it's particularly ironic because, when Comcast or some other cable company, shows television content, they actually pay the content provider. When Comcast customers watch YouTube, spend time on Facebook or Twitter, or visit websites, Comcast gets its content for free, much of it created by those very customers who are paying them for access. So you wonder, who's getting the free ride? And you start putting on these filters, like the Clothesline Paradox, and you start saying, oh, actually, maybe there should be a content subsidy flowing from the cable providers to all those free creators on the internet instead of the other way around, them kind of saying that we're getting something for nothing. $79 billion in revenue, derived from free software and free content. So on to free content, I was really struck. I have a 3-year-old grandson, and I was introduced to this whole genre of Thomas the Tank Engine train crash videos. This one has nearly 24 million views. It's a video that was made by a 4 or 5-year-old and his dad, his complex Thomas the Tank Engine train set and all these creative crashes that he's made. And, I can see that my grandson is not the only one who loves this genre. This is, the sharing economy at work. But I wanted to learn more about this, so I went down to a conference called VidCon a couple of weeks ago, which is it's kind of the YouTube gathering place, and it was amazing. I mean, the audience, probably 7,000 or 8,000 people, but screaming fans. I mean, YouTube stars come out on stage for keynote like this, and it felt like watching the Beatles. This is a young YouTube star named Charlie McDonald, had an autograph line. That's the line waiting to sign autographs for him. I mean, it's like, whoa, this is really happening. But what was really interesting is that I learned some things about how YouTube was starting to be monetized. And I heard some stories unofficially from people who didn't want to go on the record, so I can't mention names. But a major pop star actually makes more money on YouTube than on iTunes. And what's more than half of the money comes from fan video, basically user-generated videos on which they've used that pop star's music as a soundtrack. And Google has technology, which you can see in this graph. I circled down there. It says, contains content from, in this case, I can't quite read it, Dig Dis. Right? This is the viral Diet Coke and Mentos video. Right? So they use somebody's soundtrack, and Google automatically detects that and forwards the money to the music company. The person who made the video doesn't get any money. The advertising revenue actually goes to the music companies, and this is actually fueling a real economy there, which is really taking off. If VidCon is any sign, it was crawling with Hollywood agents. It was just a whole other world. So I think the sharing economy is once again being monetized in exceedingly interesting ways. So that gift, what starts out as a gift economy becomes a real economy. So, of course, then you have new disruptive businesses starting on YouTube, or fueled by YouTube, like Khan Academy. We have, I should give a shout out here also to our own sort of Maker Camp video learning experiment over on Google+, which is happening this week. This is an amazing story. I met recently with Roger McNamee, who's a well-known Silicon Valley venture capitalist, but he also has a band called Moon Alice. And they have a single that's been downloaded something like 1.4 million times direct from their website. He employs about 70 people, poster artists, roadies. They do a lot of different shows in a year. And he actually calls this the hypernet because they film all of their shows live using 6 iPhones in HD. They've got a simple mixer, but they stream them live over, directly to people watching them on phones. He says it's bypassing even the internet. It's the new creative economy at work. I won't even go into Kickstarter and how that is, changing the creative economy. But you can kind of see there's something really interesting happening here where things that were once just gift economies are becoming richer and richer real economies. Lisa Gansky has a site called The Mesh, where she talks about the sharing economy. She notes that there's now almost 7,000 companies that are doing one version or another of some kind of sharing economy play. And you look at how something like couch surfing, just for fun, has become a huge successful company like Airbnb. If you want to know how successful Airbnb is becoming, they've been out there for 4 years. In February, they hit 5 million total room nights. By June, it was 10 million. So in 4 months, they doubled from their previous 4 years. So they've hit the knee of the curve. You look at relay rides. Shelby Clark, the founder, told me recently that they have a lot of anecdotal stories of people buying a second car so that they can share them. Lisa lists companies where you're doing crowdfunding of solar projects. So there's a really interesting new thing happening. This is a page from Etsy. This is a lamp that I own. It's sort of a cheap lamp that's been made into a beautiful art object by somebody pasting cut-out circles of a music manuscript on it. The creative economy, people adding value. Etsy, by all accounts, is on the same growth curve as eBay was in its early years, really taking off as a creative economy play. And I want to just talk about other aspects. I saw a wonderful TEDx talk recently by Rodney Mullen, who, those of you who have ever skateboarded, you probably know Rodney. He's apparently the guy who invented many of the most famous street skating tricks. He was a champion skater, started a company, all kinds of things. But he had this I highly recommend this talk. He ends with this wonderful disclaimer where he says, look, I've been successful, I've been famous, and none of it matters very much compared to the creativity. He said there's an intrinsic value to creating something for the sake of creating it. He says there's this beauty in dropping it into a community of your own making and seeing it dispersed and seeing younger talent take it to levels you could never imagine, because that lives on. So when I've been thinking about the problems in our economy, and I'm thinking about what we can learn, I think about the creative economy, which includes this economy of open source. And I think back about this notion that we had back at the very first Perl conference in 1997, 15 years ago now. I introduced Larry Wall on the stage of the predecessor to this conference. And I was influenced by a comment that Eric Raymond made in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, where he talked about open source economies as gift cultures. And there's a wonderful book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift that goes into this in more detail. But the notion is that in a gift culture, you gain status by what you give away, by the value you create, not by the value you take or keep. And thinking about that, and thinking about the world's problems and this notion of creating more value than you capture, I just wanted to celebrate that this community figured that out a long time ago and has been kind of a beacon of hope for how we need to rethink the economy of the future. So what I'm really here to say is thank you for showing the way.